This program has been made possible in part by the following sponsors. The Trial Lawyers Association of BC. The Vancouver Courier newspaper. My new book about addictions, All the Way Home, Building Recovery That Works. So try these numbers, 69 programs in BC funded by the Ministry of Justice combating violence, 95 stopping the violence counseling programs in this province, 55 stopping the violence outreach programs, 11 multicultural outreach programs. If there are that many programs running in this province, what does that say about how dire the problem is? And the very perfect person to describe how dire and also the wonderful things some people are doing to struggle with these issues is Tracy Porteous, who is not only the boss of Ending Violence Association of BC, but also a much accomplished and I would say much honored person. Was it just a year ago? What did they hand you? The Canadian?
It was the Governor General's Award.
Yes.
For the equality of work I've done for the equality
Yes.
of women in the country.
Isn't that wonderful?
Yeah, I was very honored.
Yeah, that's so great. Well, I know that you're a person who's had a big imprint, and so even before we say anything, I say thank you, from the community. It's great.
Thank you very much, David.
So, tell us about the extent. It's just all over, isn't it?
It's an epidemic.
Yes.
It's considered a global epidemic of
Yes.
global proportions. About 50%, they say conservatively, 50% of women have experienced some form of sexual or domestic violence in their lifetime.
Yes.
If you actually look at how conservative those statistics are, it's probably much higher. Almost 70% of Canadians will say that they know somebody, they know a woman who has either been sexually assaulted or abused in their relationship.
Yes.
They say that 800,000 kids a year in Canada witness the abuse of their mothers. It is a very deep and troubling social problem that we have made really little advances towards over the last 30 years.
Why have we made little advances?
I think we've never really got to the extent of the problem in terms of women coming forward. Sexual assault and domestic violence are the most underreported of all violent crime in Canada. It's considered that only 1 in 10 sexual assaults are reported to the police, and only about 22% of domestic violence is reported to the police. And then if you add into that mix Indigenous women and women who are new Canadians, even less of those women from those communities report to the police. I think, and I like to think that what we discovered a program with the BC Lions football team about 5 years ago,
Yes.
we've hooked into perhaps one of the solutions that was missing. So for over 40 years, feminists across our country and across the globe have been doing whatever we can to talk about violence against women to whomever would listen. We've been educating police, we've been educating Crown prosecutors, we've been educating educators, we've been educating kids, and we've moved mountains. We have policy and legislation and programs across the country
Yes.
that we can thank women for. But what has been missing are the interventions by men. And if you really think of it, that men are 50% of the population, and if you think about domestic and sexual violence,
Yeah.
I hate to say it, but it's true that men are committing most of these crimes. And so for women who've been trying to solve this problem on our own, it's no wonder that perhaps we've taken this as far as we can take in terms of legislation, programs, and policy. So what we did about 5 years ago is approach the BC Lions. I had this, what felt like a crazy idea at the time, that we would get football players to become spokesmen for the message about breaking the silence on violence against women. And it's not from the perspective of engaging the public as potential victims or as potential perpetrators, but approaching everybody as bystanders, because everybody's a bystander.
But why did you pick, first of all, a sports organization and in particular the Lions?
That's a great question. So really, we think that part of how much traction and how much violence there is in the world has a lot to do with socialized masculinity. Obviously, it's only a minority of men who continue to commit sexual and domestic violence, but they commit it over and over and over, but they get away with it because of the broad silence. Nobody speaks up. Nobody thinks it's their issue.
Before you go on, let's spend a few minutes on what I think is one of the biggest problems, because I'm not unfamiliar with this story.
Yes.
The silence.
Yes.
Because I could not begin to tell you, it would take hours to tell you the stories I have heard of people who were violated, who then went to someone, their mother, their father, their older sister, and said, this is what happened, and everybody said, no, it didn't. What's that about?
I think it's about shame. I think we have a huge, broad cultural shame about sexual assault for sure, child sexual abuse 100%, and even about violence that is committed against us by people we love. I think it's very difficult for anybody to sort of come to terms with, what is it about me that he would hit me? What is it about me that he would do such a thing? Or what is it about our family that would be seen by others potentially, what is it about us?
And you're the last person on earth to whom I have to explain that, of course, the victim blames herself or himself.
Yes.
Because you've been speaking about women, but lots of men and boys have been beat up by their families and sexually assaulted by both men and women.
Yes.
Yeah. So the victim takes it on, don't they?
Yes.
They say, oh, I must have been, what did I do?
Well, we live in a culture that is basically set up around victim blaming. When you hear about a sexual assault, the first thing that I think often comes to mind is what was she wearing, or what did you do to lead him on, or why were you walking in that park, or why did you go to his apartment?
Yes.
In the aftermath of Jian Ghomeshi and Bill Cosby, there's been a global conversation by millions, over 10 million women tweeting in that they had been raped and never reported. And broadcasters here in our province going on the news saying that they had been out for drinks on a date with somebody, went home to his apartment, was sexually assaulted, and the first thing they thought was this terrible shame of why did I go to his apartment, and thinking nobody would believe me that this happened against my will.
There was an interesting conversation in the press recently. I can't remember if this was one of the pieces that you were involved in, talking about the culture of rape, and a public official, an elected official in this province said, I don't believe in that. A man said, I don't believe there is such a thing as a culture of rape. And I just thought, wait, what planet is this guy on?
Right.
Well,
and I think we are on the precipice of a massive amount of change. I mean, we've seen sexual harassment and sexual assault being disclosed within the confines of the House of Commons. We've seen it being disclosed within the ranks of the RCMP.
I was about to say, check the red jacket.
Yeah.
The RCMP.
Yes, exactly.
Yes.
And so these are social issues that are not immune to any culture or any community or any sector of society.
Yes.
And I think it's incumbent upon us right now. We have this window of opportunity to make social change where I think the masses are listening. I can't tell you how many organizations, trade unions and businesses are coming to my organization.
I know you're involved with the BC Fed.
Yes, saying, how can we help? What can we do to educate our people? What can we do to get our people to be more than bystanders? Yeah.
One of the cultures that I find so shocking, and they're all shocking, but the one that is frats.
Yes.
Kids who have a certain privilege, who are bright. They're not high school dropouts. They're at university, and they have 2 beers and they lose it.
Yeah.
And they believe there's some belief system that this is okay.
Or that's what it means to be a man.
Or exactly.
Which is kind of back to the question about why we approach the BC Lions, because they are like larger than life at the top of the food chain, like in terms of their size, in terms of symbols of masculinity.
Yeah.
And if these guys can present a different side of what it means to be male and masculine in the world, that it's okay to have feelings, that it's okay to treat people with respect, it's okay to walk through the world in a gentle way. So sure, they're physically aggressive on the football field, field, but there's rules and there's lines and there's boundaries around that.
And wasn't it wonderful for Travis Lulay to say, yeah, we wear this armor and we crash into each other on this marked playing field.
Yeah.
But when we step off this field, that's a no-go.
Yeah.
Nobody has to behave like that. This is football.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
And I think that's what this bystander movement is all about, that we started in BC, that then went to the Winnipeg Blue Bombers and the Toronto Argonauts and 2 of the teams in Alberta. And other communities are taking this on, is trying to get men to speak to other men to say, you know what, whatever behavior you walk by and you don't say anything about is like saying it's okay. So if you're walking by abuse and violence, if you're laughing at sexist and misogynist jokes, if you're letting kids be belittled by other people, you're giving that your stamp of approval. So we need everybody to say, you know what, that's not okay, and we're going to make that socially unacceptable.
And you must also, it just occurred to me, I was thinking about the various groups that not only that you've affected, but that you've partnered with, and I thought of the lesbian and gay and transgendered community must have really heartily joined forces with you, because so many people belonging to that community are targeted, are assaulted simply because of their orientation.
Yeah, and I would say transgendered women in particular are at the top of almost all the lists of vulnerable communities.
I didn't know that.
Transgendered women, where there's, I think a lot of guys that have been charged with killing transgendered women have tried to sort of use this sort of panic defense to suggest that they were, on a date, or they might have been paying for sexual services. I didn't realize that she was transgendered and freaked out at the time. But I think that wherever you see deep differences and divides from a difference perspective, you have more vulnerability. I mean, look what we're seeing right now with the hijab, and where there's the politics of difference being created. I think that makes people that are being othered more vulnerable.
We just have a minute before we take a quick break. I think it took considerable courage and real chutzpah on your part to pick up the phone and call the BC Lions. What was their opening response?
Yes. It was shocking. I mean, they'll say that they had to go away and think about it a little bit,
they didn't.
But I was expecting them to say no. And I sat down.
They bought in quickly.
They bought in very quickly.
Yes.
It was. I was amazed. And now they had to go away and say, okay, we don't want you to talk to anybody else about this because we think that there's potential. And then they went and had a conversation amongst their senior management with Wally Bono and their owner and some of the senior players, and they just came to the conclusion that they knew they had a platform, and they knew they had a space, and they knew that they could make a difference.
Yeah, I mean, it's an amazing thing if a Wally Bono or a Travis Lulay says to kids who are playing community football, boys, by the way, attacking girls is not a go.
Right.
Yeah. We're going to take a quick break. Terrific stuff. Thanks so much, Tracy. Well, okay, our guest is Tracy Porteous from Ending Violence Association. And your opportunity for a moment to say hello on davidberner.com. Always happy to hear from you. And also an opportunity for those lovely folks who support us to say hi here on Shaw Community Television Cable 4. We'll be back with our guest in just a moment. This program has been made possible in part by the following sponsors. The Trial Lawyers Association of BC. The Vancouver Courier newspaper. My new book about addictions, All the Way Home. Building recovery that works. Look at all the things we have in common. We both grew up in Winnipeg. Who was to know? And we survived it, and we thrived.
And we're not there anymore.
And we're not there anymore. But we visit occasionally.
Yes.
Okay. So how do you think the NFL has done? Just your off-the-wall opinion, because they've had some just god awful stories that they've had to deal with.
Yeah. You know, there was an article that came out in the Huffington Post the other day comparing the NFL's domestic violence policy to the CFL's violence against women policy that I had a hand in giving a hand, like helping the CFL. And so the journalist was interested in comparing how the two are different. And the NFL policy has a provision, 2 strikes and you're out. So no matter what violence you perpetrate, no matter what was going on in your life, that there is just next to zero tolerance. And one of the things that I was saying to this journalist that I really am proud of in terms of our Canadian policy is that it's more nuanced. So basically the CFL is saying that in every instance, they will make sure that whoever's been harmed will get help, and they will also make sure whoever is doing the harming will get help. And it's one of the cornerstones that myself and a few of my colleagues that are part of this new organization called the Ending Violence Association of Canada, we were the ones consulting with the CFL on this policy, that we said, you know, look, most women who are involved in domestic violence don't want the relationship to end. They want the violence to stop. You know, domestic violence is complicated by love and family and kids and faith and community. And
ownership.
And absolutely,
money, all kinds of things.
You know, financial dependence.
Absolutely.
And so if it is, you know, within the first instances where violence is starting to be acted out, perhaps it's not the time to have the guy have to leave his livelihood, and perhaps it could be career ending in terms of his reputation. And so the CFL policy calls for him getting help to look at his behavior and giving him an opportunity to change.
I always laugh at it because it just sounds so easy, and in fact, people have made sitcoms out of it, the phrase anger management.
Right.
But there are some darn good programs around that will take somebody who's been perpetrating violence, especially in the family, and say, okay, buddy, you're coming to this workshop, you know, once a week for the next 6 months or whatever. Tell me about 1 or 2 of those.
Well, what I'll say first is that I would agree that there are some great examples of anger management programs around, and those are generally for men who have trouble with their anger in their life. Domestic violence is no, sometimes they're the same guys, but their anger is often very directed. These are guys who might act out and beat up their spouses or their girlfriends, but do fine at work, and have never been into a fight with a buddy or anything like that. And so that's not so much an anger management issue, that's a domestic violence issue. And those men really need the help of counselors that specifically know how to deal with, counsel, and talk to men about that specific kind of abusive behavior.
Not quite getting the message that in the dance of power, sometimes you lead and sometimes
sometimes you need to share it.
Yeah. So let's talk about one of the wonderful elements on your website are things like early signs, you know, warning signs. So, and then I want to talk about building safe communities. But in terms of warning signs, a woman once phoned me at 2:30 in the morning, Vancouver time, when I was doing late night radio across the country. And she said, her opener was, David, my husband has a bit of a gambling problem. Tip of the iceberg. So because I've spent half my life as a therapist, I knew that was the tip of the iceberg. And I said almost nothing. Within 3 minutes, he's a drunk, he's violent, he's in every way. He's sexually, physically, emotionally, financially, what have I left out? In every way, he diminishes me. Right? Yeah. So talk about those. I often tell clients, when I'm working with clients, I often say, oh, you wore the gray suit. You know, who asked you to wear the gray? You know, it starts with like that kind of absurd commentary.
Doesn't make any sense. Why somebody would be angry about that.
What you wear. You know.
Well, in fact, domestic violence homicide is the most preventable of all homicides we see in Canada. And there are some very specific risk factors that people should pay very close attention to. And I'm glad that you raised it, because I think that we would be remiss in talking about this issue if we didn't also try to make transparent, you know, what some of these risk factors are.
Tell us.
So if there's ever the presence of sexual assault, if there's escalating violence over time, and especially as violence continues to escalate, where there's shorter periods between violence. If there's ever been threats of committing more severe violence or murder. Strangulation, if somebody's ever been choked, is probably the #1 potential sign of this is a situation that you need to go get some help with and talk to somebody that can do a more formal risk assessment. If he has, as you say, addiction issues, if he is using substances, if he's threatening to kill himself, sometimes guys that are homicidal are also suicidal and might want to take some people with them.
With them,
if,
yes.
You know, their kids or their spouses.
And they do, and
And
people
they
do.
And unfortunately, we've seen that. And so I've had the great privilege of talking to many families in the aftermath of losing a mother or a sister or a daughter. And what they've all said to me is that they didn't know what the signs were. A woman leaving an abusive, violent relationship is at the most dangerous period of her life from the time she leaves up to 18 months afterwards.
Yes.
So the statistics say. And I can't tell you how many families I've talked to that were so relieved when their daughter finally left the abuser
Yes.
because they thought they could relax now and that she was safe.
No.
But it actually, and most people don't know this, and how can we blame them? I mean, where do you get this information in general society? You know, through people like you, and thank goodness you're...
He's going to follow.
Yes, he follows them, and so it's when men start feeling like they've ultimately lost control, and these are violent, abusive men, not men, right? But where they've ultimately lost control, where she's either talking about leaving or where she's left, that it's more dangerous. And so if I had the opportunity to say to any woman who was in an abusive or a violent relationship, if she is thinking about leaving, go talk to somebody before you do anything.
Yes.
Get somebody to do a risk assessment and get some help developing a safety plan so you know what some of your options are before you ever disclose in that violent and abusive relationship that you're thinking of leaving, because that could be the tip-off that sets him off.
Okay, great. Now let's spend a moment on building safe communities, and I'm going to mention 2 kinds of communities
Yes.
which seem worlds apart, and yet they share some things. I already mentioned the university, because that, you know, and they have programs where we're going to make sure you can walk home at night and so on, and indigenous communities, Aboriginal communities, which have very particular issues and problems, okay? So how do we begin encouraging people to build safe communities?
Well, I think allowing people to talk about these issues. I think that violence, whether it's domestic violence, child sexual abuse, or sexual assault, these kinds of things throughout history have thrived in the silence, have thrived and flourished in the shadows where nobody talks about it. So having conversation with students about sexual assault, encouraging women who've been sexually assaulted to come forward. Like the University of UBC is doing some fantastic things. They're working on a policy and a protocol, and we've actually been working with them, training all their student life people. So there's lots that can be done. And I think generally speaking, whether it's a university community or an indigenous community, and I'll come back to that, or any community, the trick, if you will, to success is having a cross-sector coordinated response. So you're right, Indigenous women are at 4 times greater the risk of homicide.
I'm surprised it's only 4.
Yeah,
I would have said 40.
Yeah, I don't know.
But it's huge.
I don't know an Indigenous woman who hasn't experienced some form of sexual or domestic violence, but I don't know too many women in the general population that haven't experienced on the continuum some form. And so if you have Indigenous communities working together with their band health people and their chief and council, if you're talking about on reserve, maybe there's a friendship center close by, maybe there's an anti-violence service close by, and RCMP, and you bring all those people together, well, you have the opportunity to actually share the development of a cohesive response. No one sector can help either end this or even intervene properly. One of the things that my organization has been doing is developing these cross-sector responses called ICATs, or interagency case assessment teams, and we're doing this with Indigenous people and with immigrant and refugee people and with police and with mental health practitioners, and bringing people together where there is a case where people are concerned that there might be a homicide or there might be severe violence. So people can work together to develop the most cohesive safety plan and the best offender management plan.
You know, we like to say that, you know, it takes a village, it takes a community to raise a child. It also takes a community to wreck a child, right?
Right.
And it takes a village and a community to protect people.
Yes.
You know, and so nothing, in addictions, there's no such thing as an addict. No addict is in isolation, even the most lonely drunk or addict.
Yeah.
Is part of a community, and everybody actually is involved. And it's a hell of a task to get, specific communities to say, okay, we have a bearing here, we have a responsibility here. And sometimes that means that people who feel that they really don't have anything to do with this, they're going to have to make some changes.
It used to be the case that we all worked in silos. I can remember years ago, I was a sexual assault counselor.
Yes.
And if a woman came in and had an addiction issue,
Yeah.
I'm sorry to say that I said to her, you need to go deal with your addiction issue somewhere else and then come back and talk to me about your childhood sexual abuse.
Ouch.
Well, that's kind of what everybody was doing in the world of silos in the early 80s.
Yes.
Now what we know is that we need to bring all the resources to the table to help whatever that person needs, because people don't live in silos. People might have a child protection issue, they might have an addiction issue, they might have issues related to violence, they might need social housing, they might need all kinds of resources and supports that if you have a coordinated response, you can actually solve.
And it doesn't help when we have arbitrary decisions like, sorry, you're 19, we can't support you anymore.
Right.
Look, thanks so much.
My pleasure.
Yeah, it was great.
Seriously, my
Great.
pleasure.
I'm going to start crying because your passion is it's driven by something inside you. And it's just so, I can't say anything.
Thank you, David.
Anyway, I can't even say goodbye. I'm just, Tracy is just so serious about what she does, and it's such important work. Next week, green funerals, green burials, that's what it's about. Yes, there's the marble and the casket routine. Yes, there's cremation, but I just learned that cremation lets all kinds of toxins out into the air, which I didn't realize. So I've been thinking about just going and lying down in the forest near UBC, but there's a whole association that will help me do that. That's next week. Thanks for being here on Shaw Community Television Cable 4. Night.